He's pretty good. He's all right.
Right.
But he's going to be talking about his book today that was actually illustrated by a dear friend of both of ours, Ann Kent Rush, who is in a medical situation right now, recovering, but she's not hurting. I mean, she's not deathly ill or anything, but she is recovering. I'm supposed to read this, right? But for some reason, I can't really see it. So I'll just say this, that this was based on a history that was told to Frye when he was growing up. And he made a promise that he would publish this book and write down the story. So it's taken a long time. I mean, I don't even want to think how many years, because I mean, I'm as old as you are. But it's a fantastic story. I bought many, many copies. I sent one to my 2, 3, 4 to my daughters and my brother and friends as gifts, and they all come back and said it was a very, very interesting book. So without going too far into, since I can't read it anyway, I'd like to introduce Frye Gaillard. And let's give him a big warm welcome of the Pensters here.
Thanks, John. Should I come up here?
Yeah, you start speaking. Come on, yeah. That way we can do it. We can hear you.
Well, good morning, everybody. I'm glad to be here, as I always am. I've spoken to the Pensters a few times, and it's fun to talk to fellow writers and people who have a lot of diverse talents in that field. Some of you write poetry, which I couldn't do with a gun to my head, so hats off to you. This morning, John has asked me to talk about the most recent book of mine, which is called Go South to Freedom. And it's a historical novel for young readers, which is something I'd never attempted to do before. And I want to tell you the backstory of the book and read a couple of snippets from it. And then I'll answer any questions that you might have. As John alluded, this is the story that was told to me by a dear friend of mine. It's the story of a runaway slave family who were my friend's ancestors. And the story is that they ran away from their Georgia plantation and got turned around in a storm and realized after running all night that they were running south instead of north, where they intended to go to connect with the Underground Railroad and try to find freedom in the north or in Canada. And so this is the story of what happened to that family, and it was a story handed down in my friend Robert Crochon's family for over 100 years. Now, before I go into the story, I want to tell you a little bit about Robert. He was an African-American man who worked for my family. I came from an old Mobile family, and my grandfather and my 2 aunts had 5 acres of land in Spring Hill, over in the Spring Hill section of Mobile. And it was really a beautiful tract of land, and Robert was what they call the yard man or the gardener. He was the one that he came every Saturday and worked to keep the flowers blooming. And he and my grandfather plowed a half-acre garden with a hand plow. My grandfather at the time was 95 years old, and he had a deep sense of history. And it turned out that Robert did too, although I didn't know it at the time. But one of my earliest memories of Robert Crochon, and one of my earliest memories of anything really, was when I was 4 years old. And he came by my house, which was maybe a half a block away from what we call the Big House, the old southern place where my grandfather lived and where Robert worked. And he came by and he had his wheelbarrow for a day at work, and I was 4 years old, and he asked if I would be his helper. And I'm sure I was a lot of help that day. I would have these images of high jumping over the collard greens in the garden and playing imaginary games that involved cowboys and Indians and so forth while Robert did his work. But I would ride around in his wheelbarrow between his various stops, and this became a kind of habit for us. every Saturday I would look forward to Robert coming by and me getting a chance to be his helper. And this continued until I was too large to ride in the wheelbarrow, but I remained friends with Robert, not only through my childhood, but into adulthood. He worked for my family for 63 years. And I always thought that he embodied the very derivation of the term gentleman. He was a gentle man who had a great sense of dignity, a sense of his own self-respect, but a kind of, there was a kindness about him that stayed with me, and it was one of the things that, that kind of shaped my understanding, I think, of what people ought to be like. And so as the years went by, and when I was not living in Mobile for quite a while, but when I would come back, my wife and I would come back, we would very often go visit Robert and his wife Mabel, and we would talk to them about, you know, their lives and our lives and so forth. And in one of these conversations, I said, Robert, how did your family wind up in Mobile? And that's when he told me the story that became this book. And let me tell you the story as he told it to me. He said that his great-great, let me see if I get the number of greats right, I think it was 3 greats grandfather, but it might have been 2, was a man who had actually been born in Africa. He was kidnapped and sold into slavery when he was still a teenager, survived the treacherous Atlantic Passage, and became a slave on a South Georgia plantation. And he remembered what it felt like to be free. His name was Gilbert Fields. And he always wanted to feel the sense of freedom again. And he remained a slave long enough to marry and to have 2 grown daughters, one of whom had a tiny baby. And he became angry with what he thought was an abuse that had been meted out upon him, and he decided that this would be the time to run away. And so he and his 2 daughters and a young man who lived in a cabin nearby and the tiny baby all ran off in the middle of the night, like around midnight, according to the oral history that was passed down from this man all the way to my friend Robert, and actually beyond. Over 100 years of telling of this story in the family. So they ran away, and they planned to follow the drinking gourd, as the saying went. They looked for the Big Dipper and the North Star, and they were going to use the stars to guide them so they could run away to the north and connect with the Underground Railroad and move from safe house to safe house until they got to the place where they could be free. But a thunderstorm came up during the night, and it blotted out the stars, and they could not see to navigate. And so they ran and they ran and they ran all night. And the next day, they discovered that they had been running in the wrong direction. They had been running south instead of north. And they were filled with despair. And all of this, mind you, is a story that was handed down from one generation to the next in this family over all these years, more than a century, because this story actually took place in the 1830s. So they didn't know what they were going to do, but daylight was coming and they knew they needed to find a place to hide. They decided that they couldn't turn around and try to go north because they knew people would be looking for them. And so while they were looking for a place to hide, they came to a cave. And they went into the cave, and they thought they would stay there until it was nightfall, and then they would try to continue on if they could figure out where to go, but they didn't know what that would be. And in the midst of their despair, as luck would have it, the cave was inhabited. It turned out that a runaway slave lived in this cave. He had run away and decided that this was safe enough, and he could be free, and he could hunt and keep himself alive that way, and so he had contented himself with life in this cave. And so Gilbert Fields and his family began to talk to this man, and according to the story, the man said, well, you know, there are lots of things you can do, actually. He said, he is said to have told them, you can stay here with me, but that's no place to raise a little baby. Or you can find refuge, they say, with the Seminole Indians down in Florida. Or you can go to a city called Mobile, because in Mobile there's a community of free black citizens that will probably take you in. Now we don't know, Robert didn't know, how this runaway slave knew that. But the story is that he did. And so after Robert told me about getting the story up to this point, where their options were to try to find sanctuary with the Indians or to go to Mobile, Robert ended the story by saying, and I think they did both. And that was the way the oral history ended. And I said, Robert, that is an amazing story. Do you know anything about what happened after that? And he said, well, all I know is they finally wound up in Mobile because I'm here. And it turned out that the little baby who was part of the escape was Robert's direct ancestor, and she's the one who had told him the story when she was a very old lady. And I said, man, I want to write that someday. And he said, well, that would be great if you would. He seemed very pleased. And so I wrote it in that form, in synopsis form, in another book that I did, a book about my own family, and I was writing about Robert, and I told the story in a very shortened form. But I wasn't quite satisfied with it. I thought I wanted to do more with it. But I kind of put it aside and didn't really know what I was going to do. And then along came, a few years ago, my granddaughter, Gemma, who was 5 years old at the time, and had by then thoroughly wrapped me around her tiny little finger, and she knew that I wrote for a living. And she said, Granddad, when are you going to write a book for kids? And I thought, well, soon, I said. And I thought about Robert's story, and I thought, you know, maybe that could be. Maybe I could tell that as a story for young readers. And first of all, though, as I started to think about how to do that, I wanted to know more about the larger history that surrounded the oral history. I mean, did the Seminole Indians in Florida really take in runaway slaves? And was there really a community of free African Americans in Mobile? And did they sometimes take in runaways? How did all this happen anyway? And so I began to do a lot of reading and discovered that the story of the Seminole Indians taking in slaves was little known but well documented. In fact, there were the black people who lived near the Indian villages in Florida were called the Black Seminoles. And they lived much like the Indians in the same kind of houses, and they sometimes wore a bird feather, marsh bird feather in their hair, but not only that, they were very active participants in the Seminole Wars of the 18-teens and the 1830s. And in fact, it turns out those wars were aimed at subduing the Seminole Indians and shipping them off to Oklahoma along with the Cherokees and Creeks and Choctaws and others. But they were also aimed at recapturing runaway slaves, because the planters in South Georgia and South Alabama were afraid that Florida and the Black Seminoles would be a magnet for more and more runaways. And so, because there were hundreds and even maybe 1,000 or more runaway slaves and their descendants living with the Seminole Indians in Florida. And so in the Seminole Wars, the Black Seminoles fought with the Indian Seminoles against the troops from the United States Army, and fought, from all accounts, fiercely and bravely. And the Black Seminole leader was a man whose name was John Horse, and he and Osceola, the Indian Seminole leader, were close and worked very carefully to coordinate the battle plans and that kind of thing. I didn't know any of this history, but again, there's some really good books about it. And in effect, what it meant was that the Seminole Wars were the largest slave uprising in American history. And this was fascinating to me. And then I thought, okay, what about the fact that they ended up in Mobile? How did that happen? And that was a little bit harder to find information on, but I did find I think it was a master's thesis, it may have been a dissertation, but in any case, it documented life among the free black community in Mobile. And it turned out that there were several sources of free African Americans in Mobile, for several ways that that community happened to be there. One was that there were people who had never been slaves. They had been free when Mobile was ruled by the French and the Spanish, and their freedom became a matter of law when Mobile became part of the United States. The second thing was that that community grew larger when planters began to move to the city to become either professionals or merchants or whatever for economic reasons. And when they got to the city, the white planters often discovered that they didn't need slaves anymore, at least not as many. And it was expensive to have them because they had to feed them. And so what they often did was to say, you're free. And so they became part of that community. And then the last thing was that every now and then runaways would come and kind of burrow into that community and find sanctuary, even though it was dangerous for the free blacks in Mobile to take them in, because there were penalties against that when they put their own freedom at risk, and yet it happened. And eventually, that's how Gilbert Fields and his family made it to Mobile, and I was able to document when that occurred. So armed with that history, to go with the oral history, I decided to try to start writing this little book. And I struggled with it for a while. I couldn't figure out exactly the approach to take, and it just didn't feel right. And then all of a sudden, like a light bulb went off, one of those writer's moments that you can't explain and you just kind of chalk it up to blind luck or divine intervention or whatever you believe in. But this idea came to me, instead of telling it in my own voice like I've been trying to do, I need to tell it in Robert's voice, my friend who told me the story. And so I began trying to do that, and my recreation of his voice is not precise, but it's pretty close. It's a historical novel because I added details based on my reading of actual history, but I tried to stay true to the oral history as Robert had told it to me. So let me read you a couple of snippets from it, and then I'll take any questions that you might have about the story and how it's put together. But this will start at the beginning of the book and kind of skip around, and then I'll actually give away the ending too, but I think you won't mind. It was my great-grandmama who told me this story. She was old then, about as old as I am now, and that's pretty old. She didn't remember much of it firsthand, but it had been told to her so many times it seemed like she did. And of course she was there when the whole thing happened. It all went back to a night in Georgia when her grandfather, they called him the African, decided finally that he had had enough. This was back in slavery times, and he had been working so hard on that white man's farm. Really, it was a big plantation, must have been 2,000 acres, the way my great-grandmama told it. Part of it was planted in cotton, but mostly what they raised was rice. They grew it way back deep in the swamps, where the water moccasins were big as your arm. The African wasn't afraid of the snakes. He said they wouldn't bother you much as long as you kept an eye out for them. To tell the truth, he was a lot more worried about the mosquitoes. He said they would just about drive you crazy, swarming all around while you were trying to work. But the worst part of all was the man he worked for. He was a white man and he was awful mean. Carried a whip wherever he went. If he thought somebody wasn't working hard enough, or if they gave him any sass, he sure seemed happy to use that whip. One time he tied the African to a tree and tore off his shirt, told him, "You ain't nothing but a slave, and I'm going to teach you to mind your manners." He must have lashed him with that whip 50 times. That's what my great-grandmama told me. Anyway, the African decided not to take it anymore. He was a proud man, don't you know? He came from a country called the Gambia, way down there on the west coast of Africa. He'd been captured when he was a boy and sold into slavery. Was carried on a ship all the way to America. But he remembered how it felt to be free. Said he wanted to feel that way again. So late one night, when there was hardly any moon, he gathered everybody in the family together. Like I say, my great-grandmama was only a baby, but her mama was there to remember it for her. Her daddy surely would have been too if he hadn't been sold to another plantation. It happened a lot back in those sad days, black families torn to pieces when a white man decided to sell a slave. The African was already mad about that, said he had seen it too many times, and after the whipping, he decided that the time had come to run away. He knew about something called the Underground Railroad. I don't know how he knew about it, but word got around down there in the quarters, the cabins where the black people lived. The talk made a lot of people scared. The railroad was for helping slaves run away, and they knew what could happen if they tried and didn't make it. They would be in for a whipping for sure, and sometimes worse. One slave ran away 4 times. Finally, his owner got so mad he cut off his foot, chopped it off with an axe. The slave sure couldn't run after that. But the African called his family together anyway. It was warm that night, sometime around the 4th of July. He had 2 daughters who lived in the cabin next door to his, and one of them had a baby who was my great-grandmama. There was another man who was still pretty young. His name was Ben, and he had his eye on the prettiest daughter. The African asked him to come along too. He gathered the 5 of them together, including the baby, and pointed his finger up toward the sky. "That's the drinking gourd," he said. He was staring at the Big Dipper, talking softly, almost in a whisper. "Those stars right there, they're the ones going to lead us to the north." They set out together around midnight, just a-creeping and running through those woods. Then, wouldn't you know it, it wasn't very long before a big old storm blew in from the west. It was raining so hard they couldn't see the stars, couldn't use the Big Dipper as a guide. All they could do was keep on running. Just as the sun was peeping through the clouds, they came to a place where the river cut a bluff in the side of the hill. There were bushes and briars growing down the slope. Woods at the top, all tangled and thick, seemed to go on for as far as they could see. "This might be a good spot," said the African. "It'd be hard for anybody to find us here." Slowly they started to climb up the slope, trying not to get caught in the briars, when they saw what looked like the entrance to a cave. It was just a little hole in the ground, so covered with brush they couldn't even see it from down by the river. The African poked his head inside, and at first he couldn't believe what he saw. The cave opened up into a kind of room that seemed to keep going back deep in the hill. It was too dark to see